Uh, Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think people are still getting their desserts and coffee, but because of time, I think we better get started and let others join us as they come in. I'm very delighted to be chairing or moderating this panel today, which is supposed to be the first economics panel, but I think you'll agree that we've already heard a lot about economics so far today, from the very first keynote speech and in all the other sessions. And I think it highlights how the nexus between economics and security issues and geopolitics more broadly is evolving. So it's not very easy to separate them anymore, but that is one of the topics, I guess, we will try and deal with in this panel today. We have a lot to cover, but let me just say a few quick things to try and set the scene a little bit before I hand over to our eminent panel of speakers. I think we've already heard today about how important open regionalism has been to ASEAN. Mari spoke about it, and Sipana also referred to it. And I think I always like to say that ASEAN is probably the best living example of open regionalism in action. And by that I mean how it's been able to use regionalism as a means rather than an end in itself. We often hear laments about the low shares of intra-ASEAN trade and investment. We've already heard it again today. I think there's two ways to read that. One is to say integration has not really worked. And there might be some truth in that. There are a lot of non-tariff barriers still in place that limit intra-flows. But another way of looking at it is say it's not regionalism that's failed, but globalization has succeeded. So you've got low shares because overall trade and investment has grown so sharply. And if you're a small grouping, that growth must by definition, involve a lot more from outside than inside the group. So the question now for this panel is that model under threat? The original members have grown rapidly, they've developed and achieved a lot of socio-economic improvements in living conditions at a time when open regionalism was thriving, when the global economy was growing and protectionism was not a problem. But now we face a very different set of challenges, a different environment. How can ASEAN still, as a small grouping of mostly small countries, deal with that? How can they best make the best out of a very difficult situation going forward? So with those issues, I think I'm very glad we have three very eminent speakers today with us to give you something more concrete to take away. And our first speaker is Mr. Alex Holmes, who's the Director for Asia at the Economist Intelligence Unit. And next to me is Professor Shiro Armstrong, who's a professor at the Crawford School at the ANU in Canberra. And you all might know him from his many posts on the East Asia Forum, which he edits with Peter Drysdale. And last and certainly not least is Professor Kimura, who has just become president of IDE JETRO after having served for a long time as chief economist of AREA, but he's still associated with AREA. They all have very long and distinguished CVs, which you can access in your package, so I won't go through them. But with the time being short, let me immediately get started and ask our first speaker, Alex, to speak for about 15 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I have the clicker? Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It's an absolute pleasure to speak to you. So the topic I was asked to speak about is whether ASEAN economies can still thrive in the middle. It's quite an expansive topic, so maybe I'll just define what I'm going to talk about a little bit more narrowly. By the middle, I think we are talking about in between the great economies of China and the US. And there's many dimensions to being in the middle of that, but I'm going to focus on trade, mainly because it plays an outside role in the economic fortunes of countries in this region. And also, most recently, it has been one of the main drivers of growth. If you look at some of the advanced Q3 GDP data that's come out from Vietnam, Singapore, and Malaysia in the past couple of weeks, manufacturing, export-orientated manufacturing has really been one of the biggest drivers of strong economic momentum. But even though momentum is quite good at the moment, there's a lot of uncertainty for this trade-dependent region, and a lot of that uncertainty flows from an event in a couple of weeks' time that you may have heard of called the US election. It's still very much a coin toss, and so we have to consider what the possibilities would be in either state of the world. And perhaps because he would likely be more disruptive for trade, we would look at Mr. Trump as one of our risk scenarios. Now, we know what Donald Trump likes and doesn't like from his first term. He's very much obsessed with bilateral trade deficits, sees the world as made up of winners and losers, and these bilateral deficits as a sign of that. So it tends to focus on those that have a big surplus with the US. And no country has a bigger dollar surplus with the US than China. And Mr. Trump has said that he would raise tariffs on China up to 60% on Chinese imports. But he's also said that he'll raise tariffs on imports from the rest of the world to 10%. Now, we don't think this is necessarily realistic. We think there'll be pushback from business, even people within his own party, and within government and through the courts. But it's probably a realistic assumption to say it'll come somewhere in the middle, around 30% tariff on Chinese imports and 5% tariffs on imports from the rest of the world. Now, that would be up from 19% and 2.5% respectively. And we know that these big rises in tariffs can really shake up the world of trade, because we've seen the last 5 or 6 years since they were introduced in 2018 and 19. So on the face of it, these tariffs had a really dramatic effect on global trade. Here I'm just looking at US-China trade. So the first chart shows China's share in US imports. And it went from about 22% in late 2017, and it fell to below 14% in the most recent data. So that 6 percentage point drop is really a dramatic change. And this chart on the right-hand side kind of shows that more clearly. It shows imports rather, of those goods that were subject to those China tariffs. And you can see that they fell back from China and rose from the rest of the world. You won't find a more clear example of what we call a crocodile chart, because two correlated series become uncorrelated in a way that resembles the jaws of a reptile. But beware the allure of a gratifying chart, because this really doesn't tell the whole story. Because at the same time as this was happening, there was a dramatic shift. China continued to gain share in global exports. And this is when it's lost market share in not only its biggest customer, but the world's biggest customer. The US is the biggest deficit country, the biggest importer of goods. And China's trade surplus in manufactured goods continued to grow. It was already at unprecedented levels. You know, you can go back 100 years and you can't find a country that has a more dominant trade surplus in manufactured goods. And it continued to get even more unprecedented. So the question is, how can these two slides be consistent? How can you lose share, such a large chunk of market share in your biggest customer and the world's biggest customer, but still become more dominant in global trade? And of course, the answer to that is supply chain reshuffling, activity moving elsewhere. because exports, the export data only really measure where a good was just before it reached its final destination. And what we really want to look at is the entire sort of value chain of those products. And this is quite hard to do. The data on it are not very timely and not necessarily complete, but we can see signs. And the signs that we see are that China's integration into global supply chains, and in particular into the US's supply chains, has been very sticky indeed. So if you take, for instance, Vietnam, held up as the kind of biggest winner of China +1 reallocation of supply chains, its exports to the US have risen dramatically, but its imports from China have risen almost in tandem. And I haven't fiddled with the axes on this chart. It is on the same axis. And there was a Fed paper a couple of months ago, for instance, looking at the extent of US de-risking from China. And it found, even though China's share in US imports had fallen back, that blue line on the top, the share of China in imports of US suppliers had risen by about the same amount. So the consensus, I think, has actually shifted over the past year or so. And the idea that we are deglobalizing and that the US and Chinese economies are delinking has kind of lost sway. And I think we're kind of settling a consensus that China and US economies, they have decoupled in certain areas, but to a large extent, they're just as integrated economically as they were before, just in a much more indirect fashion. It was mentioned earlier that supply chains have lengthened. There was a very good paper by the Bank of International Settlements on this last year. Supply chains have lengthened, and countries have interposed themselves between the US and China and allowed them to trade, that trade to continue. And this is where ASEAN comes in, because ASEAN has been a key beneficiary of this trend. Now, as I've said, I don't think that value chains, global value added in goods has moved around nearly as much as the headline export data has shown. But even if it does just move just a fraction, the size of US-China trade is so vast that a small slice of that pie is still very satiating. So what should we take from this? Should we think that, supply chains have been phenomenally adaptable and there's not much to worry about? We can face Trump's next round of tariffs with ease? Well, I don't think we should be so sanguine, because there's a few reasons why supply chain adaptation will be more tricky this time around. And I think a lot of these reasons are actually completely independent of who wins the US election. So the first is, as I said, the consensus has shifted. So policymakers, people in this room, have seen and observed the last 5 or 6 years. They've seen how supply chains have adapted. Even the Fed is publishing papers saying that the US hasn't de-risked from China. And so the approach is changing. And US authorities are increasingly looking at third countries and putting them under the microscope. I think back in June or July, was it, the US sanctioned ASEAN solar panel manufacturers, for instance, for circumventing trade defense measures on solar panels on Chinese goods. The second point is that this is no longer a US president on his own harping on about bilateral trade deficits. There's a much broader consensus around trade protectionism now. And one of the key things that has been driving that is the issue of so-called Chinese overcapacity. And we think that overcapacity is a somewhat nebulous term, and people will argue about whether it's a problem or not. But the fact is that policymakers see it as a problem in many places, and so their actions and their trade policies are being governed by it. There is a flood of cheap but also very competitive in quality goods, and people are worried about domestic industry and domestic employment. So we've seen this kind of issue kick off what we call a butterfly effect or a cascade of trade protection measures. So for example, when the US imposed tariffs on China in the space of EVs, high-tech goods, and some medical equipment, what we saw was a wave of other measures follow suit. So the EU, Mexico, Turkey, Brazil, all introduced their own kind of tariffs. There was some muted in Indonesia as well. And so the risk really is that this kicks off a wave of protectionism. It may be related to a Chinese overcapacity. It may not. It may be used as cover to give in to some of those domestic protectionist urges that exist in many countries. For its part, it's quite encouraging, actually, that China has not kind of responded very forcefully to this. Its response so far, I would say, is fairly muted. It still has very much cards to play, such as its control over critical minerals, which is what this Technicolor chart on the right-hand side aims to show. But it hasn't played that card. Its response has been very muted, and I suppose that's a positive to take. And we think that the reason behind this is that China's economy at this moment is very dependent on external demand. Domestic demand is not very good, and it has to export a lot of its overcapacity in manufacturing. And so it has no kind of motivation, no reason to come out swinging and exacerbate this butterfly effect. So supply chain adaptation has been remarkable, but it may not be as remarkable over the coming years. So the question is, what's kind of the net effect? Where will this settle? And I think maybe to take a step back and to start answering that question, and as I often kind of say to people's work I read, you need to zoom out first. And one point to make is that trade liberalization has come a long way over the past few decades. And the point where we are now, even though there's kind of this grey clouds of global protectionism, it's still in a much better position than it was 20, 30 years ago. So we have to roll back a long way, really, to reverse the progress of the past decades. The second point is that tariff and non-tariff barriers are only one reason why goods and capital don't flow across borders. There are many, IP protection, cultural fit of your product, logistical performances of the markets you're trying to sell into. So when we produce our business environment rankings, which are kind of akin to the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business rankings, I picked out two of the segments here on openness to FDI and trade. And trade and tariff and non-tariff barriers are just one of 10 that we score. And when we score them, actually, we find that there's still a kind of a positive momentum in these categories, even in the kind of more forward-looking components. And a good example of that is that the ASEAN digital payments network, which I think was mentioned a bit earlier. You can now use a QR code to pay across several different ASEAN states. That will enable retail trade in goods and services. And it's a good example that there are still many low-hanging fruits for trade liberalization and cooperation. And it's a word that has been mentioned several times, but countries have agency, and they don't have to be blown by the winds of the US and China. There's many steps that countries can take in order to make themselves more open and benefit more from trade liberalization. So those BER scores, the business environment ranking scores that I mentioned earlier, when we kind of look at them and evaluate them and look at forward the policies that are being announced and the steps that countries might take, even after we kind of integrate the growing cloud of trade protectionism driven by the US and others, we still find that they will improve a lot over our forecast period. Of course, the key thing for that will be whether the will remains to continue liberalizing trade. And the signs so far are relatively positive, especially in this region. We look back at the previous Trump presidency, RCEP and CTPP were both signed during that period. And ASEAN was really at the forefront of carrying the mantle on trade liberalization. So there does seem to be a will that remains. There does seem to be an understanding that trade is still beneficial. And so we're relatively positive on the fact that ASEAN will continue to be at the forefront of this trend. So if I'm to sum up, I would say that the world is not sort of deglobalizing. Globalization is just changing shape. And as disruptive as that might be, and it will be disruptive, there will be opportunities. And we still think that ASEAN economies have much to gain from changing supply chains and changing world order. So really, it's kind of a bit of a positive method, I think, message. I think that, yes, there will be challenges, and I'm not trying to downplay them, but if you were to zoom out and look at the big picture, I don't think trade frictions are going to completely ruin the positive growth story of the region.
What a wonderfully positive way to end your talk. Thank you. Yes. And I think history tells us they might be right. I mean, ASEAN has actually weathered a lot of difficult times, perhaps not the full compilation of negative forces coming together at one time as they are at the moment, but I can see why you are optimistic. I think there are a lot of takeaways. I won't try and summarize them, but I think one takeaway is that whatever happens with the US elections, the US-China trade rivalry is here to stay. It's not going away. By the way, I think we know what will happen. Trump will win, or he'll claim he won. So those are the only two options. But the other takeaway, I guess, is that China isn't going away anytime soon. So get used to it. China is here to stay. We've got to live with China. But trying to do something that keeps marginalizing China is actually lengthening supply chains, adding inefficiencies, adding costs, and benefiting a few in the short term. So anyway, but thank you very much for keeping to time as well, roughly. I think we started a few minutes late, so yeah. So next, let me turn to Fuku. Yeah, 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the previous speaker talked about many things that I wanted to talk, so I can save time. So thank you very much. I'm coming from Tokyo this time, and the policy debates in Tokyo, maybe that's very similar to debates in Washington, D.C. It's really highly biased toward national security arguments. So even in talking about economic policies, actually really starting from national security, then people forget about, say, economic effects and what's the implication of policies, what's the consistency with the WTO commitments and everything. Everything is gone. Say, talking about the semiconductors subsidies in Japan, that's huge in terms of GDP. No sensible economic argument, economic analysis on the costs and the benefits out of that. Based on national security, then we cannot really consist with that. So that's a really sort of abnormal situation. If I come to ASEAN, still some part of the world economies are moving very normal. So I think I said to Japanese people that go to ASEAN and look at what's going on. Not everything is national security. And certainly we have to take care of hard national security now. So if we sit just next to China, of course, and China and also North Korea too. But talking about a sort of healthy economy, we really have to keep it. Mary Panges this morning talk about the small garden and other parts of garden. I think that way of thinking is very important. So maybe we cannot really touch that sort of policy making in the small garden portion, but the rest of the garden should be healthy and vigorous. I think that's what we really have to think of at least. So today I just touch upon three things very quickly. One is that policies in the context of geopolitical tension, particularly the US-China context, need some taxonomy in terms of the economic interpretation of those kind of policies. That's a sort of a starting point that we really have to assess policies economically. The second is the effects of two major policies on the third countries like ASEAN. One is tariff war. The other is high-tech export control. Then third point, then what would be the concern right now? One is to talk about how to set the fence between small garden and other parts of the garden clearly, how far we can do that. And the second is that how we can keep the rest of the garden healthy. So that then trade rules are coming in, and then how to protect a rule-based trading regime. I think that here particularly the role of ASEAN is now getting very, very important. So that's what I like to talk about quickly. So policy measures, first point, policy measures in the US-China confrontation. As you know that if you follow up the news, we have many, many policies in various policy modes. So it's very complicated. And also on the Chinese side, countermeasures are also pretty complicated. We cannot even know that whether or not those are really implemented or not in case of Chinese side. So the logic behind those policies is confusing. People say that this is based on national security. Okay, don't say anything about that. But we need some economic argument on those policies. So how to approach that, that's one issue that I like to talk about. So this is just an illustration that the three elements are there when we talk about geopolitical tension related policies, particularly related to supply chains issue. One is the defensive measures. This is a sort of convincing way to think of. People sometimes say strategic autonomy, but we have to prepare for the sudden interruption of the supply of important items, quote unquote important items. So that's one argument. The other side, offensive measures, that's quite different. Political scientists say that this is for strategic complementarities. Say if one country has very special technologies or very special rare earth, then they can weaponize those kind of policies against the opponents. So prepare for those kind of weapons or implement use of those kind of weapons against opponents. That's the offensive measures here. Then we have a big area of protectionism and industrial policy. So one policy has three elements in different weights. Then we can think of the economic policies and how we can analyze economically at least, and also the consistency with traditional trade norms, that we can argue that. So that's the first point that I'd like to talk about. Then mainly talking about tariffs and high-tech export control from now on against particularly the effects on the third countries like ASEAN. The first one, tariff war 1.0. So started in 2018. Then so you know that the 4 waves of tariff or tit and tat, then basically covering all products between bilateral trade between the US and China. And then actually things are asymmetry, that China's exports to the US is much, much larger than the other way around. So that asymmetry is coming in when we talk about the trade effects. And how to analyze that? That's very simplistic. Bilateral tariff war is exactly the opposite to a free trade agreement. Free trade agreement, so we have country A, country B, country C, and then A and B are having a free trade agreement. Then what would happen on the third countries? Say one is a trade creation effects generated between A and B are having big positive effects. Then that positive effects may have some spillovers to country C. So that's a positive effect. But at the same time, we have so-called trade diversion effects. Country C used to export things to country A and country B, but those exports may not be easy after that. So negative trade diversion effects are there. So the exactly opposite happens in tariff war. say, third country would have negative trade creation effects and positive trade diversion effects. Which is larger, positive and negative, depends on the country's situation in country C. Say that is say location advantages of country C, including political stance, and also the positioning in supply chains. Those are really coming in. So we have different effects. Some countries would have positive, some countries would have negative effects. So we have a huge accumulation of empirical studies on tariff war. So because that's very easy to analyze, because we know that which commodities would have such and such % of tariffs, and then trade data matches very easy. So I think we have a huge accumulation of empirical studies. Three major findings to me. One is that the tariff pass-through on the US side is very high. Tariff pass-through is that if bilateral tariff increases by 25%, what would happen in the price of that imported goods domestically in the US in this case? There's actually a 25% increase in case of the US. So that means that actually, Mr. Trump said that I'm a tariff man, tariff are good policy because money is coming into the government. Yeah, that money is coming from US consumers, actually. So that's a sort of one thing that we have to find out. Plus, we have, of course, trade diversion over there. So unfortunately, US consumers do not feel a big negative because US economy is a huge, size is huge, the trade portion is very low, actually. So unfortunately, they don't feel that. But the second, this is important for ASEAN particularly, positive trade diversion effects benefit some third countries very strongly. So particularly in the Taiwan, Mexico, EU, and Vietnam. So this is a very clear-cut results for many empirical studies. The third one, some simulation studies there. So Kumagai et al. This is actually ID Jetoros economists using so-called geographical simulation model. And then the scenarios are East blocks and West blocks are starting a trade war, tariff war. And then what would happen in third countries like ASEAN? Then ASEAN would get positive effects over there. And then even if tariffs are getting very high, the still positive is larger for ASEAN. That's the third one. Then, of course, the important assumption is that the neutral countries like ASEAN can continue normal businesses with both. And this is a very important assumption that we have to check. So this is just a proportion of ASEAN's trading partners, export side, upper side, and the import side, lower side. The China's portion is thick. Then next, whitish portion is the Western countries. So connected with both. And that's what I just want to show that here. So we are now pretty likely to have further tariff war. Some tariffs are imposed, started imposed last month, and then I'm expanding. If Mr. Trump is coming, then more would come. But as far as such tariffs are imposed only on the US imports from China, then third countries may respond to exploit possible positive trade diversion continuously. So that's one thing. But the US may impose tariffs also on imported goods from the third countries, including ASEAN, like Mr. Trump claims. Then that would have negative effects, of course. Or additional tariffs are imposed not only on the usual country origin basis, but coming on the firm nationality basis, for example. Then things are different. Or if they check the imported materials to produce those, those are, the way to disaggregate goods. And then, of course, we have to be very careful. So, and also, now, so we have a sort of big discussion on EVs in Thailand. for EVs, high tariffs are imposed in the US and the EU, so that is very likely. Then cheap EVs are really flooding into ASEAN. If a country is not producing automobiles, they don't care. Maybe consumers are happy. But if they have some production basis, they may have some resistance out of that. So that would come also. So at the same time, as the previous speaker pointed out. So we really have to be carefully watching what's going on between the US and China. The second, effects of high-tech export control. Those are really complicated. But big events were August 2020 and also October 2022. Then Japan cooperates partially for the export control on semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And the purpose of the policy is to restrict flows of cutting-edge technologies, and also extraterritoriality is partially imposed. And then the measure is more complicated, so stepping into restrictions on FDI and also movement of people. I conducted, together with my co-authors, a sort of actual measurement of trade effects of export control. And what I found is that so the restricted portion is very narrow, so quantitatively large, but that is narrower than the most disaggregated trade classification. So some people think that say world is eventually going into two, but actually the high-tech export control, the range of that kind of restriction is very narrow. So at least the trade effects right now is not very big. But we may see some sort of chilling effects due to policy uncertainties. It's very likely that the scope of export control would expand. And also the policies inside China too, so people are worrying about that. So some worries coming from the inward foreign direct investment data based on balance of payment statistics basis from 2022 to 2023, reduction by 80%. So that may come partially from a bad economy in China, but possibly sort of chilling effects are really coming into that. So further export control is likely to come. I hope that the Japanese government is resisting to expand the scope too much. But in political turmoil, actually some ASEAN member states, particularly Malaysia and Vietnam, recently attracted new investment in semiconductor industry. So we have different kinds of trade diversion here. But of course, one step further, really coming into real high tech, then ASEAN member states may need to make its political stance clearer. Otherwise, that may go through. So a couple of concerns. One is how to set the fence clearly for the private people. The US government certainly talks about that fence with US companies very in detail, but they do not have any intention to talk about that with other nationalities, of course. So we really have to think of how to set the fence, how they would set the fence, and what would happen in coming years. So we really need to cooperate for information exchange and others to set the fence looks much clearer for the private sector. This is one issue that we have to talk about. Then the other is the weakening of the rule-based trading regime. So some of the policies in this context is sometimes obviously, sometimes not really clearly, but so inconsistent with their WTO commitments or traditional trade norms. So that are weakening the rule-based trading regime. And we have WTO issues at the same time. And then we observe that some countries in the global south is also suspicious policies in terms of trade norms. So we have, because of WTO issues, we have so-called appeal into void cases. even in Australia, even in India and also Indonesia too. So, so that's where I worry. And if you see the level of commitments of ASEAN on international production networks, particularly machinery industries, that is the most sensitive sector against the geopolitical tension related policies. The commitment level is very high. So I think ASEAN should be serious about this issue. Talking about some trade data, this is a fun part, but it takes 2 hours to explain, so I just skip that. So supporting WTO, this is one thing that we have to do that. The US may walk out after Mr. Trump would come, but we really have to protect that. So one issue is a dispute settlement, including MPIA. Actually, the Philippines came in May. I think we have to encourage other ASEAN member states to come too. Then WTO as a rule maker, this is another thing that we have to support them. And then promoting regional initiatives. I think interesting move is Indonesia, so say OECD, joining to OECD and also CPTPP. I think this is a very interesting move. We really have to do many things that we really have to support a rule-based trading regime. So these are very important moves. Then in the middle and long run, at the end, we have to incorporate China into the rule-based trading regime. I think 2 things are missing still. One is national security exceptions, not just to talk about the interpretation of GATT Article 21, but policy mode by policy mode, we really have to set a line over there. So including, for example, e-commerce chapter in CPTPP. The second is a subsidy plus overproduction issues. Is it really a subsidy and overproduction issues? Or maybe the real issue is that the real problem is that China had some small subsidy 15 years ago. And then after that, using dynamic economy of scale called Marshall externalities, and they would have the real international competitiveness right now. Then how the importing country would respond. I think that's we may need some sort of a new framework to overcome that kind of issues. So I think that is another thing that we have to see. So I think the ASEAN's role is very, very big right now. So hopefully Japan, Korea, and other quote-unquote pro-trade middle powers, sorry, Australia too, to get together and then defend on a rule-based trading regime. I think that is a very important moment that we really have to step in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fuku. I think you've covered a lot of ground there, and we're tight on time, but I might just say that I think some issues we can come back to in the Q&A perhaps is whether we know about Mr. Trump's fascination with tariffs because of this confused idea that, you know, it's a great way of raising domestic revenues paid by foreigners. But I think a question we have to ask is, we know that President Biden has become a bigger protectionist than Trump ever was. And the question now is, while he might continue with new tariffs, what will he do with the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act and all the other, new forms of protection, whether that will continue and whether the net effect of Trump versus Harris will be greater or less protection. So maybe we can come back to that later. But now, last but not least, let me turn over to Shiro and 15 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Jay, and thanks to the organizers for this invitation. And it's great to join these panelists here, and you'll hear no disagreement from me, but hopefully I can add to some of the analysis already. And I want to talk about 3 things as well. I want to start with a health check on ASEAN's trade exposure. Then I want to talk about economics and security and how to think about them together perhaps, and especially for ASEAN. And then finally, the role of open contestable markets. really, and the importance of that and what that means for ASEAN. So let me just get started. This issue that was raised before that Jay mentioned on intra-regional trade shares. You can see here how stable they are, and people point to ASEAN's intra-regional trade shares. This is 22% or so of ASEAN's trade is with other ASEAN members, and is pointed to as not much regional integration, whereas the European Union, of course, close to 60%. Like Jay, I'd caution that this isn't really the right measure. You know, what's the optimal amount? It's not 100%. You don't want to probably be where South Asia is, but the importance of ASEAN here is that it's successfully integrated into the global economy, and it's the center of regional and global value chains. And this high trade exposure, and we're sitting in Singapore, of course, that has the highest trade to GDP ratio, is a source of prosperity, but I would argue also a source of security for ASEAN. Now, we'll come back to this because now with the weaponization of trade and all the uncertainty, it's being seen by some as a vulnerability and a risk, not just a source of security. But ASEAN's integration into the major partners, the United States, China, Japan, for example, unwinding that would not just be very costly, but it'll be so costly, I think, that it'll be a source of economic and political insecurity. And I'd say raises security risks. So ASEAN has the most to lose, really, globally, and I think all the modelling suggests that, from a fracture of confidence in the WTO or the global trading system. And that's to make the point that we haven't quite got there yet with the WTO and the multilateral system. It's under threat, but it's far from dead, and that's pretty important, I think. So I want to think about, just briefly, with the help of these two handsome gentlemen from the 1700s, you know, is trade a source of prosperity and security, or is it a source of conflict through vulnerability? And Montesquieu, the French philosopher, is often cited in these sorts of studies and in the literature that goes back, obviously, centuries. Peace is a natural effect of trade. And we're used to that here in Southeast Asia as part of the DNA, where we think of the commercial peace, or at least the economic integration raising the costs of conflict. And of course, we have examples all throughout history and present day. But of course, none other than Adam Smith pointed to, well, it should be, but it isn't. And in The Wealth of Nations, he said, commerce, which ought naturally to be among nations, as among individuals, a bond of union and of friendship, has become the most fertile source of discord and animosity. And this you can see between the United States and China today, but all throughout history and around the world as well. So which is it? Who's right? And of course, for me, the answer is it depends on the regime within which they're engaging economically. And we've been able to separate trade and economics from high politics or security because of our post-war regime. And you only have to look at Japan and China, for example, or other cases in East Asia, where China's signing up to these rules and norms, and other countries signing up to these rules and norms, has allowed that separation. So you could integrate economically despite difficulties of history, of regional rivalry, and the political ups and downs. So this regime, the Bretton Woods institutions, the economic institutions that were negotiated, it's worth remembering the context within which they were negotiated. The Second World War had not finished yet when these were being negotiated at Bretton Woods. The GATT, IMF, and World Bank, these are not just economic institutions, but those who negotiated these very much had the 1930s in mind and the security, national security in mind. Trying to avoid a repeat of the 1930s, where economic rivalry, beggar thy neighbour policies fed conflict, fed rivalry and fed conflict. So this, I think, is a very important lesson of being able to mitigate and manage a lot of risks. There's always security risks and other risks in economic engagement, but the US-led order was able to manage those risks for us. Now we're in a world where the security imperative is dominating the economic imperative in many countries, and the United States has gone from enforcer of that system to spoiler of that system. So countries, companies, communities are having to self-insure and manage that risk in a much more expensive way. And of course, we've talked about this already at length. I won't spend too long on it. But the problem with the US-China strategic competition is that it's zero-sum. The United States especially sees any gain by China as a loss to itself. This is not how we think of economic competition. That's strategic competition, zero-sum. Economic competition is positive-sum. You invest in yourself, you do better, and there are positive spillovers to other countries. But these zero-sum, this zero-sum competition is not just leading to zero-sum outcomes, it's leading to self-harm economically, restricting trade, restricting investment in the name of security, and leading to negative-sum outcomes. So you just have to think of the prisoner's dilemma outcome, but generalize that more broadly, and Danny Quire and I have called that an epic fail equilibrium. And we're headed in that direction. This is the trajectory we're on. Both the United States and China are forcing other countries to choose sides. So I think with that weaponization of economics and the threat of tariffs, I thought I'd just show an example, a recent example from Australia of the episode of Chinese economic coercion or attempted economic coercion, because I think it's important to learn the right lessons. So as many of you probably know, in 2020, China restricted about a dozen of Australia's goods coming into China, worth about $20 billion. Now, China was the largest market for all of these commodities. I've just shown 4 here. 40% of Australia's exports were going to China, and there was obviously a political dispute, and suddenly trade was stopped. So you can see barley going into China stopped overnight, coal very quickly, wine, timber, this includes beef, lobster, and other commodities. You can see Australia's exports to the rest of the world in this aqua colour rising rapidly for everything except wine. Now, turns out wine markets are fairly protected globally, and it's harder to take the Australian label off and stick another label on, but the Americans did a good job of taking Australian markets in China. The point of this is this would not have happened in 1930 when markets were closing globally. We have an open global economy with the World Trade Organization as a reference point against protectionism, and there are alternative buyers and suppliers everywhere. And it turns out the WTO and the multilateral system, as threatened as it is, still provided the exit ramp from this episode for Australia and China. So China was a founding member with Australia of MPIA that a few people have mentioned. So the rules are enforceable for Australia and China and the other third of the membership, or about a third of the membership of the WTO that's joined MPIA. So this blunted the economic weaponry. If you think about economic weaponization of trade, this protected Australia. And of course, flexible markets domestically, very important. And I think that's an important lesson to learn. Now, I think a lot of governments, after this episode and other episodes of attempted economic coercion, are focused on reducing trade shares, diversifying trade at quite significant cost, potentially, and worried about the next episode of economic coercion. But looking at all the episodes of attempted economic coercion, they've either failed economically and or politically. They've backfired. So I don't know what we are so afraid of. And one of the responses that I don't think has taken off in Southeast Asia, but you can see there's a temptation by Australia, by Japan, by others, is the idea of friendshoring. This is a great quote I like from Winston Churchill. Our planet is not a very big one compared with other celestial bodies, and I see no particular reason why we should endeavour to make inside our planet a smaller planet called the British Empire. So this was, even with trusted dominions, the colonies of the British Empire, that was not enough, of course, for Winston Churchill. He changed political parties over this issue. This idea of friendshoring first you have to define who your friends are. The US divides the world neatly into what they think are democracies and autocracies. But it's really code for decoupling from China, largely. And this is not consistent with key fundamental principles of the multilateral trading system, like non-discrimination and a level playing field. So what are we going to do? And I've got a few minutes left, Jay. Well, we've talked a lot about the domination of security over economics through the day. And we do see security interest mission creep and that yard growing. That starts to become very dangerous because, of course, we all need to take security risks seriously, but they cannot dominate everything. If you put a security person in the room, they tend to dominate decision-making, or security interests dominate, because the price is infinite for these people. No amount of risk is worth giving up. Sovereignty, you can think about all the problems with this calculus. We obviously need a balance. When you have security interests dominating so much, you're headed towards a corner solution. So this is a simple production possibility frontier, if you will, but you can think maybe it's not a straight line, just to illustrate. A corner solution is what we think about in economics, but you can see quite quickly it's a dark corner you're heading towards, a North Korean corner we can call it, where security dominates everything else. You are not richer and you're not safer. But you could be within this frontier, and there are policies that give you both security and prosperity. And also, it's not a static set. You can expand your policy space and policy options. And this is where I think a very good example is ASEAN. So the more ASEAN can work together and keep the region open, stable and prosperous, you're going to be expanding your policy space. Being squeezed by the great powers is going to narrow your strategic policy space, I would argue. This is perhaps a bit academic and a bit too much of a mental model, but I find it quite useful. So what's needed now to protect what we have for ASEAN and the rules-based system? Well, I think strengthening ASEAN-centered institutions, and we've talked about many of those, RCEP being very important. Somebody mentioned that CPTPP and RCEP was saved during Trump administration. This gift from the region that ASEAN isn't really taking seriously of RCEP, when the whole world is becoming more protectionist. Not only did East Asia draw a line and stand firm, it committed to liberalization. But there's an economic cooperation agenda as part of this that has not been activated. There's a potential secretariat, we have a support unit, ministerial process, a potential leaders process, and joint committees. Need to have a clearer strategic direction for ASEAN that brings together the pillars, to manage these security risks. We're not just in a world of the economic pillar, security pillar, and social cohesion. These need to be thought about together. And if we think about open contestable markets in this region, and I talk about ASEAN plus its important partners in Northeast Asia and Australia and New Zealand, that gives ASEAN embedded collective resilience. So that institutionalizes resilience. It keeps markets open, gives you alternative buyers and alternative suppliers. So I think in everything that ASEAN does, appealing to multilateral principles, to the system, to encourage countries to join MPIA so that the rules are enforceable. And we had a conversation, Jay and I, with other panelists in Tokyo. It looks like Indonesia is preparing itself to join MPIA, which would be good. It has some trade disputes with the European Union that the European Union can appeal into the void, if it so wishes, unless Indonesia signs on to MPIA. And the past nickel cases that Indonesia has appealed into the void don't count anymore. So I think there's some hope. I think many of the other issues were discussed that I want to talk about, but let me just conclude by talking about we are already in a more multipolar world. Power is further dispersed. The BRICS group is larger in purchasing power than the group of 7 advanced economies already. We need a more robust multilateral system to manage this new world we're in. We can't let the dissatisfied great power tear it down. The United States is going to continue to be an important part of the global economy. We need to keep the system functioning for our own benefit. But of course, when the United States is ready to re-enter more fulsomely, we should keep it open for them for that precise reason. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shiro. I think I'd like to come back to this point about the MPIA, if we can, during the well, we're moving into the Q&A. I think it's been raised several times today, not just on this panel. And I think when you talk about weaponizing trade policy or economic policy in general, I mean, you can't think of many more effective weapons than to take away all defenses from within, or disabling defenses from within, which is exactly what the US has done with the appellate system, right? So what can we do to try and recover from that? And how can we get the momentum going with Indonesia and others also coming on board? But these are some issues we could look at. But first we have, I think, about 20 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. We started a little bit late. I want to open up the floor for questions from all of you. You know by now where the microphones are, so please make your way to the microphone, introduce yourself, and if you have a question to a particular speaker, please identify that as well. So the floor is now open. Yes, please, Karen.
I am Karen. I'm from ISEAS. Thank you so much for your insights and presentation. I have questions specifically for Mr. Alex. I understand that EIU has a team of researchers looking into the geopolitics of critical mineral supply chains. So I'd like to hear your insight on that, because as you know, China dominates the critical supply chain processing sector. Right? It's also the largest producer of 20 plus commodities, including rare earth minerals. And we also know that there are some groupings coming up to focus its cooperation on mineral supply chains, such as the US-led Mineral Supply Chain Partnership, as an example. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on how do you see the critical supply chain going forward? What are the recent developments that we should keep our close eye on, and what would be the implications for Southeast Asia? Thank you.
Thank you. My question would go to Kimura sensei. You have briefly touched upon this topic in your presentation about the need to get China to get involved in the rules-based trading system. And we know that China has applied for membership in the CPTPP. So from your perspective, or the Japanese perspective, setting aside the geopolitical considerations, which in reality could not be set aside, but anyway, what does it take for China in terms of its national economic policy making, especially in terms of the changes that it needs to make for it to get the favorable consideration of countries like Japan for China to become a member of the CPTPP? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take one more and then we'll get answers and then come back to the second round. Yeah. Sorry, Prof. We'll come to you after. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Ben from Chatham House. I found myself listening to you all nodding and thinking that sounds great, but also thinking, am I in the 1990s? And have you guys sort of read any media or listened to any politicians recently? So how, with all these great ideas, which probably everyone here agrees with, how are you going to convince politicians and the public that that's the right way to think about things? Because right now the political argument in most of the world is going in exactly the opposite direction. Thanks.
Okay. I think we'll start with you, Alex, and then
Yeah, sure. So I'll start by answering Karen's question, which was on critical minerals. And as she rightly pointed out, if you look at kind of who extracts critical minerals, China is completely dominant. But then if you widen that to who extracts and refines, then it's even more dominant. it has complete control over the critical mineral supply chains. And the US did notice this a few years back or more, and has started a US-led strategy to try and secure its own kind of supply chain for critical minerals. But the problem with critical minerals is the time where you discover a deposit until you're actually operationalizing a mine and you've got refined product coming out the other end is decades. It's measured in decades. So really, we don't think that the world's dependency on Chinese critical minerals is going to change anytime soon. It'll take many years to change. That's not to say that there won't be kind of countries that will benefit from efforts to shift away from that. So most of them are probably in LATAM, but there's a few countries in ASEAN as well that are probably going to attract investments because they've got critical mineral deposits as well. And as I mentioned in the presentation, this remains one of the cards that China has to play in trade wars. Let's pray that it doesn't, because it really could just completely cripple lots of very important industries such as those involved in the green transition.
Yeah, for the second comment on that, I think that Japan and China do not stop talking with each other on the basis of trade rules, actually. So we have some small things are coming up, anything, and then so first we talk about things in terms of trade rules. So both are not really discarded trade rules 100%, like the US and China, actually. And also, I think that China has, I'm not sure that China is really respecting the contents of international rules. They really appreciate that or not, I don't know. But at least they have a very strong desire to get a good respect in international fora. So that including WTO. So we really have to utilize that. And then I think in terms of the WTO, at least, and also the regional trade agreements that we have in China, we really have to utilize rule-based arguments over there. So that's at least what even Japanese government would do that right now. But in the future, say, if we have to stop somewhere, sometime that really no rule, just fighting regime. We have to get out of that somehow. And in order to do that, so we have to have some end picture that China is really coming into rule-based trade regime somehow. And then it may not be very easy, but what is their problem from our viewpoint? And then how we can fix that kind of their problem under sort of rule. Whether or not that is really going through or not, this is another question, of course. But we really have to crystallize what we really want China to do in rules, actually. So I think in that context, say national security exceptions, and also how to think of subsidy overproduction and stuff. I think we have to prepare for a sort of rules in order for China to do that from our viewpoint. And then certainly we have to think of how to convince them, of course. But that should be a sort of ending point in the middle and long run. So that's what we have to do that, I think. On CPTPP accession issues, I wrote some articles on that. My assessment is that not political issues one place, of course, but we should not say that because of political reasons we do not admit such and such country cannot come. But we really have to talk about the contents, like the level of commitments on that. So in terms of CPTPP, still China has 4 issues to be solved. One is liberalization. That's a goods, services, investment, and others. The second is state-owned enterprises issue. Then e-commerce, particularly in terms of national security exceptions. Then labor. I think they have to make a strong commitment on those issues, otherwise they can't come. Maybe we are setting a sort of a very high hurdle for Indonesia to come, but I think we have to talk about the contents rather than just a political, jump into a political explanation of it. How to convince, so it's very quickly, how to convince policymakers. Please teach me how to do that, actually. So I really want to do that, but it's very difficult to do. But at least we have to, in case of Tokyo, we have to talk about economic matters at least. Okay? Then also talking about small garden and the other part of gardens. That kind of thinking should be there also in policymakers. So at least I'm trying to do that a little bit, but if you have a very good way to do it, please tell us. Thank you very much.
Sure. And any of the policymakers in the room that want to answer that question, I'll invite it to come in later.
Yeah, let me just build on Kimura Sensei's answer on this China CPTPP, and then I'll try to get back to Ben's question. Look, I think realizing that all 12 current CPTPP members have a veto on new members, that puts Australia, Japan, all of us in a pretty unique and important position. It'll be a pity to waste this opportunity by not even getting to the starting line. So I think China may never join CPTPP. It may not be able to meet the technical requirements, but the process could be extremely important. I just have to look back to China's WTO accession that took 15 years. There was a process of unilateral commitments and liberalization that they continued to undertake, and that built confidence and it built trust. And that sounds like what we need right now, with the Chinese wanting to get in, engaging in a process where they make unilateral commitments along the way in liberalization that reforms the Chinese economy in the way that the reformers there want to use external leverage and the way that we want China to reform, and then to do that process and build trust and confidence along the way. And I think that comes to sort of trying to answer Ben's difficult question. I think the first thing to recognize is the stake that the Chinese economy and the Chinese society and government has in the current system. You know, I think immediately think about friendshoring or decoupling. A Chinese economy and society that's less integrated into the global system is one with more risks, I would argue, not one with less risks. These are very big constraints, and the Chinese depend on, as the world's largest trading nation, no major formal allies, depend on the rules and those institutions to manage its trade exposure and its big trade relationships with everyone. And now, it's abusing the rules like the United States does from time to time, but we need to work with the fact that they have a stake in that system to engage it in the CPTPP process and so forth. And now, what do you do? How can you mobilize a political will? Well, it looks pretty grim. The reality on the ground is very different from even when we get the politicians saying the right things, but there are some rays of hope. I mean, Mari Pangestu this morning, she's been appointed as Special Envoy on International Trade and Multilateralism, reporting directly to the new Indonesian president. That's a pretty positive sign. It's a small thing. But there are other positive signs. I think out of self-interest, countries are one by one joining MPIA. Out of self-interest, this part of the world signed RCEP when everyone else was raising trade barriers. So I think always identifying the costs of heading down this trajectory that we're on and making it clear that we have agency, and this trajectory we can correct with collective action, and then to do some of the calculations and modelling to show that, well, in a world where this system falls apart, the ASEAN economies fall by 8% of GDP, or what the IMF models. Those sorts of calculations, I think, are quite powerful. And before things get really bad, there's a chance of correcting the trajectory a bit, mobilizing political will. Best I got, sorry.
Thank you. We'll take one more round. Yes, first I invite Professor Chan Eng-chi.
Thank you. I thank the panel for this very interesting exposition of this question of economics, trade, competition between the United States and China. I'm chair of the BOT of ASEAN, of ISEAS, in case you're wondering who I am. I listened to Mr. Holmes' exposition, and you said something which surprised me a little, which was that the extended supply chains, all the diversion, did not actually bring about inflation, in the cost of goods going up in the United States. And you say this is because the US is a large economy, so it could be absorbed elsewhere. But we are hearing a lot of discussion of the United States wanting to fix the countries that are now which is hosting the diverted supply chains, like Vietnam, countries in Southeast Asia, and will be targeted with tariffs soon. The question, and here this whole panel can answer this, I think Mr. Armstrong talked about this and Mr. Kimura too. It seems to me that the United States is very bent on dealing with China, and the competition, unfair competition. I think some measures were necessary, but too much of one thing then becomes excessive and it swings the other way. And my question is this: trade competition, economic competition, and strategic competition go together. You're winning maybe on the economic competition. You're going to push back China for a while, a few years, 10 years, 5 years, but you're losing the strategic competition because you're going to get everyone thinking this is so unfair. I don't think ASEAN countries will like it when the tariffs come. And what are you doing this for? And the awareness that the small yard, high fence is getting to be a larger yard and a higher and higher fence. So if you could just answer that, the strategic competition and the economic competition. And I don't believe I've seen anything of anyone arguing to the United States, before the United States, that you really have to balance.
Thank you. That's quite a substantive question. So because of time, I think I can only take one from Karthik, who had his hand up earlier, I think.
Thanks. I wanted to piggyback on the question of the domestic politics of trade. I think especially in the United States, what you've been seeing is there's very little political support or will for trade, right? And so this one dimension is how do you generate more of that? I'm not very skeptical, right? But there's another dimension. There's a political economy dimension here. There are certain industries in the US which are quite large. There are firms that have acquired a lot of market power within certain industries in the US, especially the tech sector, right? And a lot of them are actually clamoring for less trade. They're not pushing for, and they're not pushing the USTR or the US government to become much more vocal and getting multilateral digital trade rules on the table, right? So even independent of the security competition which is taking place, the political support for trade, there are certain political economy dimensions in key economies, especially the United States, where the market concentration of power is actively pushing against global trade solutions. So how do you deal with that going forward? Thanks.
Thank you. We're eating into the coffee break, but I'll invite everyone to be a bit brief in their responses. Yeah.
Sure. Perhaps maybe I wasn't as clear as I wanted to be, but I didn't necessarily mean that it didn't bring about inflation. I think definitely putting tariffs up increased inflation, both directly for the United States, but also indirectly by making supply chains less efficient than they could be. My main point was that it didn't necessarily bring about de-risking. So the US and Chinese economies were just as integrated, well, not quite just as integrated, but very much integrated, but just a lot more indirectly than before. But as to your question of kind of whether it's a negative thing for the US to continue doing this. I think that all kind of economic modeling, although we've talked about the fact that supply chains have been extremely adaptable, it's still a cost. And the counterfactual of a world where this doesn't happen is a faster growing world economy. But at the end of the day, that as has been mentioned on this panel, we've got to deal with the world as it is, and that counterfactual is somewhat academic, and that US-Chinese rivalry is going to continue. And the US is going to continue being protectionist for those political economy reasons that were mentioned, and ASEAN kind of has to think and chart a course through that.
Right. Either of you want? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to take the two questions at once. I mean, it's clear that the United States has put primacy and strategic competition over its own prosperity. And I think, when you've got the protectionists and the security hawks in the United States, unified, and this is the only thing that brings the two parties together as well, protectionism and a very anti-Chinese lens to see the world through, and everything starts to be seen through that. I mean, what do the rest of us do? Well, I think the first thing to do is to recognize that this is what's it been driven by? Well, a lot of inequality in the United States, a lack of a social safety net, and a large proportion of the population that has missed out from globalization. Now, that, I think, we can assume is going to continue it's not going to be fixed anytime soon. If Harris gets in and has a U-turn on Biden policies, most unlikely. I think we can see this continuing for 2 or 3 presidential terms, if not 4 or 5. The key then is, what do the rest of us do? We don't let the United States tear apart the system. They've already made sure the dispute settlement system in the WTO doesn't work. When I was in Washington, someone told me we're going to be like India in trade negotiations from now on, vetoing everything just 1,000 times bigger. This is a bit of a problem. This is where we need to actually collectively work together, I think, to defend the system, the multilateral system that we rely on, and then through regional agreements, plurilateral agreements, and MPIA being one plurilateral, is to modernize or revive the system, I think, because it's out of date anyway, but it's weakened. But the alternative world, if we let this go, is a very dangerous world of poverty and insecurity, I would argue.
As for the domestic politics of trade in the US, I think 3 kinds of contexts over there. One is sort of really classical, in a sense, protection on legacy industries like steel. I think that they used to have sort of they have a market power, used to have it. And then we had the international cartel, in a sense. But the international cartel is now getting very weak. And so they really need to protect, really, in a kind of really very, very straight manner. That's one context. Another is a high-tech sector. In the context of US-China confrontation, they are doing export control of high-tech technology. I don't think that the industries are happy about that, actually. So they have so some part of our semiconductor production, they have international competitiveness. So they'd like to sell their products to China too, actually. So if the government imposes a high-tech export control, then they narrow down a sort of market. So I think they are resisting to some extent. But in the logic of national security, say those are could be utilized for weapons or as technological competition over there in the long run, they would cooperate to some extent. So I think that's another context. And then in case of the Netherlands and Japan cooperating in export control, I think that's in the case of Netherlands stuff, then certainly that manufacturing equipment is directly using for sort of really high-end semiconductors. But in case of Japanese machines, those are not really directly making semiconductors. So I think the background would be that those kind of semiconductor-related industries have some conversation with the US government. That's my imagination. And then, okay, so we would do such and such things. So let somebody, like Japanese firms, to do such and such do and so to bear the cost for that kind of policy. So I think they do not have any intention to protect Japanese farms, of course. So I think that's a sort of game that we are doing at the second context. Third context is talking about market power. Then certainly the current issue is big platformers, GAFA and others having a sort of really strong market power, I think. This is another context, but right now, under Democratic Party government, they are having a sort of pressure. But I'm not sure after the US presidential election. So that's the third context that we have to watch.
Thank you, Fuku. Okay, so before I wrap this up, I think I have to do one thing, and that is to pick up on the discussion here on, we talked about export controls. We know that when it comes to binding quantitative restrictions, the effective rate of protection is infinity, right? Much more than any kind of Trump tariff we could aspire to. And all of this has happened under the Biden administration. I think Shiro is right that we can't expect a Harris administration to wind back on any of these big ticket items. So I want each of you to tell me what you think, who you think will be more protectionist in net terms, assuming that if a Harris administration continues, the Biden CHIPS and Inflation Reduction Act and continues with the non-tariff measures, and assume that Trump perhaps doesn't have the intellect to do those in such a sophisticated way and sticks to tariffs. You can say T or H for your vote.
T.
Well, T, because he'll tear down institutions domestically and globally as he does it.
I don't know.
Okay, so on that point, let us thank our panelists for a very interesting discussion.